Good morning, Mheshimiwa.
Morning, morning.
So who is Honorable Dr. Otiende Amollo?
Well, I would say I'm a simple village boy. Born to a village carpenter and a housewife in a large family of 10, mostly girls, who had the opportunity, by the grace of God, to go through school and become an advocate. That's what I am.
What inspired you to pursue your career in law?
Many years back, when I was 9 years old, and my father was working as a casual laborer in what is now Maseno University. It was then called Siriba Teachers College. And the principal then adopted what you could only say were inhumane policies of sacking people without notice and without good reason. And my father, as a casual laborer, is the only person who had courage to face him and walk straight to his office and try to tell him that that kind of practice was unfair. It was unnecessarily targeting people without any due process. The principal asked him who he was, and he said his name. Asked him whether he was an employee of the institution, and he said yes, as a casual laborer. Principal told him, you know, I can sack you immediately. Well, he told the principal that even if you do, I'll have told you what needs to be said, and I won't die because I still have a home to go to. He was sacked on the spot. He wasn't just sacked on the spot. We were then living in some very tiny quarters within the institution. So he was frog-marched from that office, led to those modest quarters, and every earthly belonging was taken out of the institution. So him and my mother and the rest of everything were dumped at the gate of the institution. So when I came back from school at that, I was then in class 4. I was redirected. I was told I could not access the place, so I was redirected to go around because that place has 2 main gates. So I went and found my family stranded there, and we had to survive by the grace of well-wishers for a few weeks before my father relocated home completely. And I thought about that event and how it happened and the injustice, the inhumane manner. And I told myself that I wanted to be a lawyer because I had seen clippets of what lawyers do in terms of pursuing justice. That is what inspired me to do law.
That is quite a moving story. So how has your legal journey been?
It's been an interesting one. So I wanted to do law so much that when I was in, I actually made a decision in class 6 that I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't know any lawyer then at all. So I had this theory of what lawyers do and how you can be a lawyer. So when, by the grace of God, I finished my primary school and I was top of the class, I was then invited to join Miranda High School then. And I made a decision. I had already made the decision. So when it came to the career choices, and I chose law in all the 3 options. Our careers master returned the form and thought I was stupid. He said, you have 3 choices, you can't just make one choice. So you have to feel it afresh. I told him I'd made up my mind. If I could not study law, then I didn't know to go to university. There were other options. It became a big deal, so they called the principal and they called other people, but I would not budge. I stood my ground. So they decided that I was stubborn and stupid, but they would submit it with that stupidity. So by the grace of God, I was then admitted to study law, and I was quite happy with that. That is how my journey started. So, well, we joined the university, and it's important to mention at this point that throughout my education in high school, my fees was paid by well-wishers. particularly some Catholic missionaries. By the time I joined the university, my fees was actually paid by my sister, Senator Elizabeth Ongoro, who herself had been a student, was just now finishing. But at that time, there were these stipends that students were getting, what we used to call boom. So she divided her money between paying my school fees and also spending on her own needs in school. So that's how I studied law. And then the study of law was interesting. And I think I should tell you the story of how I came to work with Githu Muigai and Mohamed Nyaoga. So when we were in second year and we were studying criminal law, and at one stage, Professor Githu Muigai came with a question, and the question was on allegiance and the crime of treason. And they asked the class whether a foreigner could be charged with treason. And I thought the answer would be yes. And most of the class thought the answer would be no. And so did Professor Muigai. And I sought to tell him that my understanding of the law led me to believe he was wrong. But he insisted. So what I did is that we went to the library. I invited 3 of my friends. So we now went to the proper treatises on the law of treason. And we each came with a bundle. You may know Professor Migaya Kech, he was one of them. You may know an advocate called David Otieno in Kisumu, he was another. And you may know Owino Seko, now the legal officer at Nation Media. So we all came with these very huge treatises. And so when Githu then came to class, I raised my hand and told him, Prof, I think you are wrong. And he maintained his ground. So we spent 4 hours of going through the treatises. So I started and then I invited each of my friends. So the class for that day was suspended and we took 2 more hours, much to the chagrin of my classmates. Let's just say we didn't quite agree on that. And so when then the exams came and Githu set that question in the exam, I chose to take that question. It was not mandatory. I answered it the way I thought that I knew. When the results came, I didn't pass too well on it. I got a B, which was rare. And so I confronted him and told him, I don't think you should, condemn me for holding a contrary opinion, which in any event is supported by many texts. He offered to remark my paper, but I rejected. But that's how we became friends, because I think then he knew that what's always the case, that you can hold a contrary opinion. So from then on, I then started being attached to the firm of Mohammed and Muigai, and later when I was admitted, I worked there for some time before I joined Rachir to found what is now Rachir and Amollo Advocates. In between, I did many things. I've always been in civil society. I've always been in professional organizations. And I have done a lot of things in between, which you may be familiar with. But the constant is I consider myself a practitioner. And anything else that I do is just a sojourn. I remain and will always remain a practitioner of the law.
What have been some of the challenges that you've encountered in your legal journey?
Wow, there are many. One of the earliest challenges was the discipline of holding people's monies, a lot of money, which you can draw at your own instance while you are broke, and yet having the discipline not to touch it. This legal profession is the one where you can hold 100 million for people, and you need 10,000 for your own needs, but you cannot touch that 100 million. It requires a lot of discipline. I have seen many of my friends who've gone down because of that liberty, deciding that let me take that 20,000, I will later replace it, and then something happens. That is one. Two, the legal profession and the practice of law is by and large a very jealous calling. you can only do so much while you're practicing and not more. So that even for some of us, some of the things we do, you must be sure that it is consistent with the practice of law. If you try to do too much, if you try to practice at the same time you're entering all sorts of other businesses, you get muddled and you lose it. You lose focus, you lose everything. Because the practice of law requires a very high level of personal engagement. And you cannot always delegate, because when you delegate, things are bound to go wrong. Those are two challenges that I think every young advocate must learn. One, the resistance to the temptation to touch clients' money, however little. Two, the avoidance of mixing too many things and too many businesses while practicing law. Yes.
Recently, you delved into politics. What inspired that decision?
It's an interesting one. First, I consider myself an activist. And throughout my career, I am involved in a lot of activism in the various organizations in which I served, including street activism. And the essence of activism is that you need certain things to be changed. The culmination of our collective activism in this country was the Constitution of Kenya 2010. I then had the opportunity to serve as one of the members of the Committee of Experts. And therefore, I had decided that now I had the final opportunity to make the changes we'd been craving for. And I would say that by and large, we put almost everything we needed to put in that constitution. And that's why some people have called it an activist constitution. But there's no apology to make, because if that's what we needed for this country, that's what we had to get. Thereafter, there then arose the question of implementation. And I asked myself, if therefore we had been craving for these changes, we now have them in the Constitution, and now there's an opportunity to implement that Constitution, not just the academic idea of having those provisions, but the actual implementation. Why then don't I take that opportunity so that I can implement, we can walk the talk? That is why I applied to be the first ombudsman of this country, and I got that opportunity. And I told myself, let me then spend these 6 years implementing so that people can see that what we wrote was not just theory, it was implementable. So as ombudsman, and therefore as an implementer, I took the opportunity to try and remedy some of the maladministrative wrongs that were so rampant in government. And I did quite a bit that we can always revisit. I brought in the idea of punishing wrongdoing and gratifying right doing. So we even introduced the idea of the Ombudsman Awards to outstanding public officers, while we condemned by naming and shaming those who we thought did not live to the standards that are required. So we did all that. Then I quickly realized that it is not enough to be an activist so that change can come through the Constitution. It is not enough to write those things in the Constitution. It is not even sufficient to be part of the implementers of the Constitution, because the Constitution is only one document. But there are over 500 pieces of legislation. Making of the law on a day-to-day basis is the business of politicians. So at one time, when I was in a trip in Geneva, a human rights trip, and we had this discourse about the way Kenya had been governed and where it was going, and we discussed from where we had come from to where we were at that time, and I would still be mourning some of the things that the politicians were doing or not doing, especially the fact that a lot of the legislation that Parliament was passing was not in tandem with the Constitution. It was less than expected. So in many ways, Parliament was toning down instead of raising the bar in the Constitution. And then somebody challenged me and told me, if you feel so passionately about this, why don't you join Parliament? And it took me back. And so I thought about it overnight, and I realized that they were right. They were right in the sense that you can be a lawyer, but as a lawyer, you only go to apply the law that has been passed by Parliament. You can be the best judge, but as a judge, you only interpret that law that is passed by Parliament. So ultimately, whether we succeed in lawmaking or not, ultimately depends on the quality of that legislation. And it therefore depends on the legislators. And I realized that as much as legislators are vilified, although I'm used to that because lawyers have been vilified all through history, I realized that rather than complain, if you want to ensure that there's quality law that is in tandem with the Constitution, that there's proper oversight over that legislation, then you join them. That's when I decided to join politics, and the rest is history.
As a follow-up question to that, politics is deemed to lack integrity. So what are your comments on integrity and politics?
I think it is a general condemnation, which if you are to believe, and if you believed it so much that you shied away on that account, then you'd be doing yourself and the rest of humanity a disservice. Lawyers have been vilified ever since history began. And so you will have phrases attributed to great scholars saying, if you want to be safe, start by killing all the lawyers. And yet, throughout history, even those who uttered those words, when then the time came for them to face the law, they would look for lawyers. It is the lawyers who would prosecute them, it is the lawyers who would defend them, it is the lawyers who would judge them. Mere vilification of an entire profession or an entire group is not reason enough to keep out. I can tell you, having joined politics, that there are a lot of politicians with integrity. But it is true also that there are many other politicians without integrity. Ultimately, it's a matter of personal choice. It need not, you need not compromise your own standing and your own views merely because you've joined a profession. The challenge, as far as I know, is not really the challenge of integrity. The challenge that I've seen so far since I joined politics is the challenge of party politics, where a party makes a decision that you may or you may not fully agree with for a number of reasons. Then the dilemma is, do you stand with the party or do you stand with your conscience? But like every other situation, what is important is that there's a robust opportunity to debate before the decision is made. But if that opportunity has been accorded and the decision is made, then as long as it's not a matter that compromises on your own integrity, then it is right to stand with the party, because there must also be some level of party discipline. However, if it is a matter that touches on your own personal conscience and belief, then you must have the courage to stand your ground. And if that alone must cost you your membership or your continuance to serve, even as a member of parliament, then you must be prepared to go with that. I have once or twice been in that situation, and I can tell you that if I came to a situation where my own personal conscience conflicts so fundamentally with either the position of the party or the position of parliament on a fundamental matter, I would voluntarily resign as a member of parliament and stay with my conscience. And I have no qualms about that. Yes.
And finally, Mheshimiwa, what advice will you give to, one, young advocates who would like to join politics, and two, just young advocates in general?
I would seriously encourage them. First of all, if you look at the democracies around the world, and if you use the US, for example, as a foundation of the UK, you will find that at any one time, almost 1/3, if not 1/2, of members of parliament are lawyers, and it's not by coincidence. It is first because it's a law-making body, and by definition, lawyers understand the law, and therefore it comes naturally that a law-making body should comprise of a number of lawyers. Secondly, the practice of law and the training of law exposes you to critical thinking and free thinking in a number of things. You know, law is a social science, not a natural science, where you are constricted and restrained that this is the formula, you must get to that answer. In law, we are trained that you can use any avenue as long as you can reason it out. And ultimately, that's what politics in its pure form is. The ability to reason out freely and to explain why you are going and how you've arrived at that conclusion. Thirdly, the fact that you are free to practice, and the fact that by and large you may not be employed, especially as a practicing advocate, you are essentially self-employed, gives you the liberty to venture into politics without having to resign any office, and therefore the ability to continue in politics while you're still running your law firm, even if you're not as active. But ultimately, the comfort that if you don't make it, you still have somewhere to come back to. You just come back and continue practicing. That is a liberty many professions don't have. That is a liberty which, for example, as a medical doctor, you may not have, because doctors do the work almost personally. Okay? If it's an operation, you cannot send somebody to go and hold your brief. Either you are doing the operation yourself or not. It's a liberty that many other professionals, for example, who are in employment do not have, because once you resign, you may not always get your job back. But I would strongly encourage many lawyers that as long as you take the view that legislators do not always debate sufficiently, as long as you take the view that the laws that emanate in Parliament are not always the best laws, as long as you take the view that implementation of those laws may not always be sufficient, then it is important that you consider it. If, as a person, as a food critic, you find that the food is not good enough, then enter the kitchen. And that's what we did.
Thank you so much for your time today, Mheshimiwa.
You're most welcome.
Wish you all the best.
Thank you.
In future endeavors.
Thank you very much.